Okay. Anything else, guys? Okay. We can just go on mute and just, look at each other. As my dad would say, comb your hair, right? If you have hair, we'll go with that.
Would you guys like to pledge allegiance to the Japanese flag or the American flag tonight?
I'm going to vote American.
I only asked because I was grabbing that enormous one that's in my office so that we had something to pledge to, and then I realized I had a small one in my window.
Hello. Got my best watering outfit on tonight.
Hi, everybody.
Hey, Jordan.
Hey, Jordan.
Mick, you got on. No problems this time?
You actually came on early tonight.
I was watching.
Wait, now go.
I was watching you guys. You did very well. I think Pete's at his own house tonight. Think he's going to get his up.
And then just hit mute.
Looks like we got everybody here but Jenna. Mr. Mayor, did you know when, there he is, answered my question right there. There's Mr. Duff.
Jason, when we go and it's time for you to speak, if you would go with your video, that would allow us to see you on our live stream. So if you could do that when you go to the time you're going to speak.
You got it. All set.
Hey, Peter, can you hear me?
I can. Can you hear me?
Yes, but your video's off.
Oh, okay. How do I turn it on? I can see you.
I don't know if there's a little
On the
recording.
left-hand side should be a thing that says start video.
Okay.
Lower left.
No, I came up with a Bellefontaine Joint Recreational District thingy. Host has asked to start. Okay, start my video.
That's it.
You got me?
Not yet.
Okay, I see you. I see Jenna. Can you see me, Jenna? No, obviously not.
No, it's showing up as your name, Pete, but I think that's still, we just don't get to see your smiling face.
Okay, what do I press to get, do you see my, it worked last meeting. Start my video. Okay.
Yes.
Okay, I press start my video.
You do have a camera on that computer, right?
It's my cell phone.
Oh,
I couldn't get Zoom to load onto my laptop for some reason.
Well, here's what we'll do, Peter. We're about ready to start. If we can't get the video working, we'll have to have the clerk call you to vote, and we'll just have to listen for it. So just make sure that your microphone's on.
Okay.
All right.
Yep.
That being said, it's after 7:30. The Bellefontaine City Council is now in session. Please rise for the invocation by Councilwoman Baker, followed by the Pledge of Allegiance.
You're unmuted.
Heavenly Father, guide us this evening as we make decisions that affect our neighbors and the larger community of Bellefontaine. We ask you to watch over our military and their families, our president in leading our country, as well as our first responders who have dedicated themselves to our protection. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen. I pledge allegiance
Pledge allegiance to the
to the
flag
flag of the
of the United States of America
and to the
and to the
republic
republic
for which it stands, one
one
nation,
nation,
under
under
God,
God,
indivisible,
indivisible,
with
with
liberty
liberty and
and
justice
justice
for all.
for all. Okay, we made it through another pledge. Thank you, everybody. Will the clerk please call the roll?
Mr. DeSoma,
Here.
Mrs. James,
Here.
Mr. Kurtz,
Here.
Mr. Lyle,
Here.
Mr. Reeser,
Here.
Mr. Springs,
Here.
Mrs. Baker.
Here.
Excuse me, may I have a motion to accept or excuse me, suspend the reading of the minutes? Councilman Springs, seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lyle,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Are there any corrections or additions to the minutes? Seeing none, we'll move to administrative reports. Mayor's office, Mayor Stoller.
Thanks very much, members of council. I'll also add a couple things for David Henry. He was in here having a full day today, but something came up and I didn't ask too many questions, but at the end of his day, he said, I may or may not make it back. So I told him, I'm certain you guys would understand. Even in finance committee, I jotted down a couple questions. So if there's anything that you would have had me relay to David, I'm glad to do that for you. Our East Sandusky bids are now back. So we're excited to continue that project, which would be everything from storm sewer to water being laid out there. And of course, the road work, the road will be widened. The lowest bid came in 7% above our estimate, which is still doable. So we'll have a meeting about that and see if we can't keep that rolling. The next item, I wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the thinking behind canceling the bicentennial event, which would have come up this Saturday. I think I've been working on it personally for just short of a year. So it's with tears in my eyes that I tell you we're not going to do it. Some of the news headlines, while I was waiting for this meeting, I went out and grabbed a couple of them. You know, it's unfortunate. I think it's a little bit like crying fire in a crowded theater, but you haven't actually seen the fire. The news was starting to report, and Dr. Hodnott was sharing the numbers openly that coronavirus was on the rise, that last week we had 71 cases where we averaged 28 cases. So you can see the significance there. And at that time, last Thursday, we had 7 people hospitalized here locally, and 2 has been our average since March. So it's significant. And so they were, I don't know, they had their crystal ball out saying that, well, 4 of the 7 indicators were met. So we're going to go red. Well, if our county went up to that 3rd level, it wouldn't have been advisable to have a public event. Probably everybody would have to wear their mask. What fun is that out under the blue skies trying to enjoy a street festival? So I'll just take those same plans. I've got a folder that's about 1 inch thick.
I don't know what's happening here.
We'll work on it. I'm sorry, Bonnie.
Bonnie, your microphone's not muted.
Okay, anyhow, I thought Bonnie was asking something. Anyhow, next summer, so it'll be 200 plus 1.
Okay.
It'll be better off. Bonnie, you want to mute there you go. We are having 2 different weekends now of DORA events this coming weekend. One of the items I had was a smaller car show, because there's still the hill climb with vintage race cars out at Mad River Mountain, and they're going to bring their cars downtown. They'll display them along Chillicothe, and so there will be a DORA this Friday and Saturday, same hours we've been using. And next weekend will be the first Friday in September, and that's pretty much when we're trying to also help downtown business with Dora's. So the next 2 weekends will be Dora events. I have a note, of course, we don't have police chief on, but if any of you were able to take in the community safety event, it was very successful. It had a little different look to it this year because keeping everybody safe, but it ended up being a beautiful day. I was visiting with Finance Committee. One of the things that we're trying to order with some of our CARES Act dollars, so I say try to order, we've placed the order 2 weeks ago, but it is to add video equipment to your council chambers so that not just through this period of time that we're all putting up with and Zooming, but for the unforeseeable future, you'll be able to live stream your meetings. You'll be able to record them as a video. You could save them and as well post them. So we're excited. It would appear as though lots of people are trying to use their CARES Act dollars to grab video equipment. So we're in a little bit of a stall as far as delivery and installation, but we've placed that order several weeks ago. Two last things. We have a bicentennial tree. It's and shade tree. Weighed in on that, told us just the right tree to order, and it's about a $400 tree, and we have $200 from Rotary Club and $200 from Kiwanis. I think this is going to happen, and just watch for an email, probably a Wednesday evening, because one of the two presidents, that's Jason Robeson with Rotary, and Scotty Elliott is Kiwanis president. Those are the two I picture with their clean shovel of dirt. You know that that look when you're planting a ceremonial tree. But I would also like to invite City Council to come and almost form a half circle back behind them so that you are witnessing this event in our bicentennial. So stay tuned. You'll be invited. It's okay if you couldn't make it. I do want to include all of you. And yet beyond that, I can't make the picture much more crowded. So we'll have to behave where we're standing. One last thing, Mr. President, I would offer to City Council 2 appointments this evening. They're continuations of several appointments that I make over the years. One is Civil Service Commission. Colton Lowry, who's with Edward Jones, has served us faithfully, and he's willing to continue. That's a 3-year term, and he's up either early September or late August. So Colton Lowry. The second one is Joe Antrim, who not only is our county commissioner, but he presently chairs the Shade Tree Commission, and his seat is about to expire, and that's a 3-year term. Both of these gentlemen have agreed to continue to serve. So at this point, I would ask if you would please take a straw vote, and then I'll offer them a letter and thanking them for their service.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Before we get to any questions from anybody, I'll ask for a motion and a second to appoint Colton Lowry to a 3-year term to the Civil Service Commission. Motion by Mr. Springs, second by Mr. Reeser.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Okay, and I'll ask for a motion and a second to appoint Joe Antrim to a 3-year term to the Shade Tree Commission. So moved by Mrs. Baker, second by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
Yes.
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And now that we've concluded that, are there any questions for the mayor? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Mayor, for your report. We'll move to Law Director, Mr. Stolle.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good evening, Council. I just wanted to report that we did get confirmation from bond counsel that they have received all the necessary paperwork to fund the new bond refinancing, which is set to close the first week of September. And they are just waiting for the funds to be placed in escrow, and they'll share the good news when they're able to reissue those and save the city significant monies. Two other matters have come up where we're going to ask, I would ask that Mr. President, you assign to the Rules Committee 2 issues for consideration and review. And that is, recently we had a complaint to our code enforcement officer, Mr. Dodds, regarding an above ground pool. And it's come to his attention that there is some language in 2 different provisions of the city's ordinances that appear to either conflict or sort of muddy the waters as to what the height and use restrictions are on those items. So to prevent any future issues, I would ask that that issue be sent to Rules Committee for consideration, and I will provide further details for their review. And then the second item, something was brought to my attention by the city prosecutor regarding a potential conflict between a city ordinance and a state ordinance. And I would also ask that the Rules Committee be assigned that review, and I'll put them in direct contact with the city prosecutor for further explanation. But if there are no further questions, that ends my report.
Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Are there any questions for Mr. Stolle? Seeing none, I'll refer those 2 issues to you, Mr. Kurtz, and the Rules Committee, the above ground pool issue and the conflicting city ordinances, as well as the conflicting, potential conflicting ordinance between the city ordinance and state law regarding some criminal matter, I presume, for your committee for further consideration, okay?
Okay, will do.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Thank you, Mr. Stolle. Anything else for Mr. Stolle? Seeing none, we'll move on to auditor's report. Mr.
Thank you, Mr. President. A couple things. The auditor's office has been very busy lately. A lot of it is dealing with the CARES Act money and allocation and usage of that. There's 2 ordinance, well, an ordinance and a resolution before you tonight dealing with those. Also, we're starting our budget planning sessions, and hopefully to get started in that in a couple weeks. We have a report from the state auditor's office, which I'll let Mrs. James address that, and that'll end my report unless there's any questions.
Thank you, Mr. Brentlinger. Any questions for Mr. Brentlinger? Seeing none, that will conclude our reports. Administrative reports will now move to report to standing committees. Finance Committee, Mrs. Baker.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have several ordinances and a couple resolutions on for this evening, or one resolution, I guess. Ordinance 2053 is supplemental appropriations that will amend the ordinance that we just passed at the last meeting on August 11th regarding the coronavirus funds. And this will allow those to be available for distribution. The money, the dollar amount is the same, but it's been moved around so that we have more money available through miscellaneous accounts, so that we would be able, it'll be easier to expend those funds that way. So we're going to be asking that for first and final so that those can be set up quickly. So we'll be asking to waive the 3 reading rule on that one. And then the second ordinance is 2054, and that'll be for first reading only. This will allow the police department to accept the Ohio Attorney General Law Enforcement Body Armor Program grant. The total is $5,500. The city's match is $1,375. And this allows the police department to get 5 more of the body armor vests. This is the 3rd year in a row that we've gotten this grant. So this has been a big help. I believe the mayor, or Fred said that this has covered about half of our vests to this point. So hopefully it will continue to be able to get that. Those kind of funds will be available. So that's first reading only. And then we have the resolution 2055 that establishes the new revenue accounts to do with the coronavirus funds. And those are make additional general fund coronavirus relief funds. So we'll be asking for adoption on that. That ends my report, Mr. President. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Baker. Rules Committee, Mr. Kurtz.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Kurtz. Safety Committee, Mr. Lau.
Thank you, Mr. President. I have no report.
Thank you, Mr. Lau. Utilities Committee, Mr. Springs.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report.
Thank you, Mr. Springs. Streets Committee, Mr. DeSoma.
Thank you, Mr. President. We have one resolution amending a previous resolution permitting certain improvements in the public right-of-way, the property at 137-141 West Columbus Avenue. That's all I have, Mr. President.
Thank you, Mr. DeSoma. Sidewalks, Curbs, and Parks Committee, Mr. Reeser.
Thank you, Mr. President. No report tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Reeser. Audit Committee, Mrs. James.
Thank you, Mr. President. Just a quick report tonight that the Auditor of State has released the final audit report, and it is available on the State Auditor's website for 90 days, and it's also available to the public on the city's website. And that ends my report.
Thank you, Mrs. James. That concludes the reports of standing committees. We'll now move to the portion of our meeting where we welcome communications from citizens. We did not have any communications from citizens that were submitted in writing to the clerk by 6 p.m. The Sunday before council. And again, just to remind the public that we do invite our public to participate in that form or fashion to submit those writings to the clerk by 6 p.m. the Sunday immediately preceding the city council meeting. We do have one guest with us tonight to speak, I believe, to resolution 20-56D, and that's Mr. Jason Duff. We'll invite him to speak to council at this time. Good evening, Mr. Duff, and you're permitted to proceed.
Thank you, Council President, and good evening, Council. Jason Duff from Bellefontaine, Ohio Properties. Tonight, we have in front of you a proposal for an amendment to a resolution that was approved for an outdoor patio in front of what is to become the Flying Pepper Cantina and build co-working space. I really appreciate the approval of the resolution. The reason why we're asking for the amendment is with the success of outdoor dining in downtown Bellefontaine, and also with us experiencing unprecedented times with COVID and how that's impacting restaurants. The very small footprint and kind of intimate environment that we've designed for the Flying Pepper, having outdoor covered space allows for that restaurant to have more outside dining that can be used longer throughout the season. And then also with the co-working building and the amount of residents and tenants that will be utilizing that property, having that expanded outdoor space will be a huge amenity for our downtown. We have worked with the architects and engineers to propose a modular system. This system would be bolted on to the top of the concrete. We've been working with the city engineer office and the mayor's office to look at this design and to be sure that it doesn't expand the footprint that's already been improved, but uses the existing footprint that has already been permitted. We understand that this modular system, at some point in the future, we could be asked to remove it. And if that is the case, it can be removed. It would be engineered by a professional engineer and submitted to the Logan County Building Authority and also to the city of Bellefontaine for approval with our zoning permit. At this point in time, we did sit down and meet with the Planning Commission and provide and review and answer any questions the Planning Commission has. We did get unanimous support for that proposal, but we're now here in front of you tonight to provide and answer any questions that you might have. We did provide copies of 2 renderings. The first rendering shows the architecture design of the covered steel structure within the footprint. And then the other rendering shows a plan for how any drapes or screening could be pulled down on there to shield in a rainstorm, if rain was to come, how that could be covered. I think with the thing that I'm just really thankful for City Council's support of our downtown, I think of driving around and seeing how much our outdoor spaces are being used, people on the sidewalks, we think that this would be a huge enhancement to West Columbus, and ask for your support. I'm happy to answer any questions from council.
Thank you, Mr. Duff. I will point out that I did receive notification from the Planning Commission that your proposal was approved unanimously. And then also Mayor Stoller circulated to members of council administration an email that included photographs of the renderings that you submitted to the city. And I believe that all of council has received those and reviewed them. Are there any questions for Mr. Duff? Mr. Springs?
I just have a quick one. So I've seen the sunshade that comes down. I'm just curious though, if there would be any plans to enclose it kind of like Brew Fountain has done with the heavy vinyl, and then move in the space heater so that it could be used all seasons.
At this point, no, I don't think that's possible. We, from a safety perspective, do not like the kerosene heaters with an enclosed structure. And I also don't believe, part of the requirement for sprinkler system is once you reach a certain square footage, you're required to put a sprinkler in the building. And based on what we have found with our architect, if we were to enclose that, we would be required to have a sprinkler system. So if you think about the patio, it really would be more of a 3-season experience. The challenge that we have, if you see with restaurants right now, when we have weather where it may sprinkle, 600 has to allocate tables on the inside so those guests can be reseated, because in Ohio weather it's just not consistent. Where a case like Brew Fountain that has coverage on the patio, if we do get a light rainstorm, we don't have to deal with that. But the footprint of the Flying Pepper now post-COVID with social distancing, we went from a dining room of about 60 people to a dining room that's less than 30. You can see what that would do from a business model standpoint. So we do believe, not only are we asking that we think this would be a really great enhancement to West Columbus, but it really is a huge tool to keep a restaurant in that space successful.
Thank you.
Yep.
Any other questions for Mr. Duff? Seeing none, thank you, Mr. Duff, for your report.
Thank you.
That concludes our communications from citizens. We'll now move to our legislative agenda for the evening, ordinances for first reading.
An ordinance making supplemental appropriations and amending the County Coronavirus Relief Distribution Fund for purposes of general fund, fire, police, and miscellaneous, and ambulance, and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker?
Motion to waive the 3-reading rule.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz?
Yes.
Mr. Lyle?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Motion to pass on first and final.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz?
Yes.
Mr. Lyle?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes. Oh,
Mrs. Baker?
move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma?
Yes.
Mrs. James?
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz?
Yes.
Mr. Lyle?
Yes.
Mr. Reeser?
Yes.
Mr. Springs?
Yes.
Mrs. Baker?
Yes.
An ordinance authorizing the Service Safety Director and/or Police Chief to apply for and accept an Ohio Attorney General Law Enforcement Body Armor Program grant and declaring an emergency in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mrs. Baker?
Motion to pass on first reading only.
Seconded by Mr. Spring.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
A resolution establishing new revenue accounts within General Fund 101, Court 405, Water 605, and Ambulance 630.
Mrs. Baker.
Move to adopt.
Seconded by Mr. Springs.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
A resolution amending Resolution 20-10 permitting certain improvements in the public right-of-way located at 137 to 141 West Columbus Avenue in the city of Bellefontaine, Ohio.
Mr.
Move
DeSoma.
to- Move to adopt.
Thank you. Seconded by Mrs. James.
Mr. DeSoma,
Yes.
Mrs. James,
Yes.
Mr. Kurtz,
Yes.
Mr. Lau,
yes,
Mr. Reeser,
Yes.
Mr. Springs,
Yes.
Mrs. Baker.
Yes.
That concludes our ordinances and resolutions for first reading. There are no ordinances for second reading, and there are no ordinances for third reading. So that concludes our legislative agenda for the evening. Are there any communications from the clerk?
None this evening, thank you.
Thank you. Are there any communications from members of council?
Mr. President.
Mr. Reeser.
I want to let you all know, and more importantly, the people of Bellefontaine know that I was actually diagnosed positive for COVID-19 last week or 2 weeks ago when we had our meeting. I was on recovery. I was waiting for a diagnosis, but I had a pretty bad weekend before that. And I want to highlight for everyone, this is a real thing. Please take it serious. Listen to medical professionals. I'm also a school teacher, and we are gearing up for the school year, and everyone is very concerned that if this continues to grow and spread, that we will have to shut schools down. Now, that's not my decision, and I'm not a part of that committee that decides that, or that the administration that decides that, but I want to highlight for people, please listen to the Logan County District Health, listen to Dr. Hodnott, wear a mask, wash your hands, please be cautious when you're out in public. This is not something fun. I had a bad experience with it. And I want to make sure everyone is staying healthy and staying safe. And, we can get through this together as long as everyone's doing what they can. So please do what you can, folks.
Thank you, Mr. Reeser. And I'll just highlight that, a couple of weeks ago when Mr. Reeser came down with this, in normal circumstances, we would all been in the same room together. So again, very, very appreciative of Chris and the mayor and setting up, helping to set up these Zoom sessions. We're still able to do our business. We're able to be safe, especially right now with things kind of, for lack of better words, heating up. So I appreciate all that, and I appreciate everybody else's patience and working with this. And so far, so good. I have one item. We need to set we might need some further discussion about this, and I might need to make an announcement at a later date, but we need to have a hearing on the P. Allen Properties zoning request pursuant to revised code 112906. We need to have that published in a newspaper with 30 days advance notice. So what I think we'll do is I'll maybe talk with the mayor and Mr. Stolley to see how we sort of do this public hearing in COVID via Zoom. I don't know how that's going to work. So before we make that announcement and before we have the clerk schedule that, it's looking like we're probably going to have to use October 13th anyway, because just the way that the schedule works, 30 days notice, we wouldn't have a council meeting anyway. We normally have those before a regularly scheduled council meeting. So we have a little bit of time to figure out how we're going to do this meeting. Maybe get some input from the mayor and the service safety director and Mr. Stolley as to how we should do it. And then we'll make a plan as to how we have that kind of a meeting, whether we just ask for the public to submit their comments in writing, or maybe we open it up to a larger venue and do it in person. I get, you know, a little bit of that maybe depends upon how things are going at this time. So I just want to throw that out there to everybody, and then I'll be working with Bonnie. I'll get back in touch with you, and I'll discuss the same with the mayor and Josh, and we'll develop a plan to get notice of that published in the paper. But everybody here will know that, and we'll schedule whatever special hearing we have prior to a regular council meeting on a second or a fourth Tuesday of the month. So right now, looking like maybe October 13th, but that's not quite final yet. We'll see, but I'll let everybody know. Okay. Any questions about that? Seeing none, I don't have anything else. If there's no other communications from anybody on council, I'll entertain a motion and a second to adjourn. Motion by Mrs. James. Do I have a second? Second by Mr. Springs. We're adjourned.